Everything you think you know about Judas Iscariot is wrong. In 2006, National Geographic released their official translation of a 1,700-year-old Coptic manuscript that archaeologists had painstakingly restored from fragments. Carbon dated to around 280 CE, this ancient text is called the Gospel of Judas, and it completely rewrites Christianity's most infamous betrayal story. I've spent years studying the actual translated document, not the rumors or speculation surrounding it. What I found isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented archaeological evidence that reveals something extraordinary. This gospel doesn't portray Judas as the ultimate traitor who sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Instead, it presents him as Christ's most trusted disciple, specifically chosen for a sacred mission that required tremendous sacrifice. The early church hierarchy recognized the threat this text posed to their entire power structure. They systematically destroyed every copy they could find, orchestrating one of history's most successful cover-ups. But one manuscript survived, buried in the Egyptian desert for 17 centuries. What exactly does this forbidden gospel reveal, and why were church authorities so terrified of its message? Picture this. You're holding a manuscript that powerful people spent centuries trying to wipe from existence. Not just hiding it or discouraging it, literally hunting down every copy and burning it, making possession punishable by death. That's exactly what happened to the Gospel of Judas, and the fact that you can read about it today is nothing short of miraculous. Around 180 CE, a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyon was having serious problems. Early Christian communities were reading texts that told completely different stories about Jesus, Judas, and the nature of reality itself. So, Irenaeus did what threatened institutions always do. He wrote a massive tome called Against Heresies, specifically calling out the Gospel of Judas as dangerous fiction that needed to be destroyed. But here's what's fascinating. Irenaeus wouldn't have bothered writing against something that didn't exist or wasn't influential. His very condemnation proves these texts were circulating widely and gaining serious traction among early Christians. Think about it, you don't wage a literary war against irrelevant documents. What followed was systematic destruction on a scale that would make modern book burnings look amateur. Early church councils didn't just discourage reading Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Judas. They organized actual hunting parties. Roman soldiers would sweep through Christian communities, searching house by house for forbidden manuscripts. If they found copies, the books were burned publicly. If they found people hiding them, those people faced execution. This created an impossible situation for monks and scholars in places like Egypt, who had spent their lives copying and preserving these sacred texts. Imagine being a monk in a Coptic monastery around 350 CE, hearing that Roman soldiers are approaching your community. You know they're coming specifically to destroy your library, texts you consider just as sacred as anything that would later become the official Bible. What would you do? These monks made a desperate choice. They gathered their most precious manuscripts, sealed them in clay jars, and buried them in caves and desert hiding spots, hoping that someday, when it was safe, they could return for them. Most of these buried libraries were never recovered. The monks who hid them were killed, exiled, or simply died before they could pass on the locations. Fast forward 1,600 years to the 1,970 seconds. Egyptian farmers near the town of Alminya were doing what farmers do, working their land, probably thinking about crops and weather and feeding their families. Instead, they stumbled into a limestone cave and found something that would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship. Inside that cave was a leather-bound codex, wrapped in cloth, sitting exactly where those desperate monks had left it centuries earlier. The farmers had no idea what they'd found, but they knew old things sometimes had value. So this priceless manuscript entered the shadowy world of black market antiquities, a world where historical treasures get treated like stolen jewelry. For the next 3 decades, the Gospel of Judas was passed between dealers, collectors, and middlemen who saw dollar signs instead of historical significance. The manuscript spent 16 years locked in a safety deposit box in New York, slowly deteriorating because nobody knew how to properly preserve ancient papyrus. Every year it sat there, pieces were literally crumbling away. By the time serious scholars got involved, they were looking at a jigsaw puzzle made of fragments smaller than postage stamps. The restoration process was like performing surgery on history itself. Conservators worked with magnifying glasses and tweezers, trying to piece together words and sentences from papyrus pieces that would disintegrate if handled wrong. But here's where the story gets really interesting, and where you start to understand why this discovery made certain people very uncomfortable. The authentication process involved carbon dating, ink analysis, linguistic verification, and examination by Coptic language experts from Princeton, Yale, and other institutions that definitely aren't known for promoting fringe theories. National Geographic assembled a team that read like a who's who of biblical scholarship. These weren't conspiracy theorists or religious rebels. These were tenured professors, forensic document analysts, and specialists in early Christianity who had reputations to protect. When they announced their findings, they weren't just saying, "We found an old book." They were confirming that this text represented authentic early Christian thought that had been systematically erased from history. Translations revealed details about early Christian practices that mainstream churches still struggle to acknowledge. For those ready to explore what the establishment doesn't want public, our free Insights Academy newsletter shares the complete picture, including your complimentary copy of the Kabbalion for understanding these ancient mysteries. What's particularly telling is how quickly certain religious authorities moved to discredit the find, using remarkably similar language to what Irenaeus wrote 1,800 years earlier. Same playbook, same fear of alternative narratives, same insistence that only officially approved texts could be authentic. This pattern reveals something crucial about how inconvenient historical evidence gets handled by institutions protecting their narratives. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, scholars spent decades controlling access to translations. When Gnostic texts were found at Nag Hammadi, similar gatekeeping occurred. It's almost as if there's a systematic approach to managing discoveries that might complicate official stories. The Gospel of Judas survived because of a perfect storm of desperate preservation, accidental discovery, and modern scientific analysis that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. But how many other texts didn't make it? How many alternative perspectives on early Christianity are still buried in caves or were successfully destroyed by those ancient hunting parties? That limestone cave near Alminia wasn't just hiding a manuscript. It was preserving a voice that powerful people spent centuries trying to silence. A voice that's about to tell us why Judas might not be the villain we've been taught to believe he was. Here's what will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about the most famous betrayal in human history. When scholars finally translated the Gospel of Judas, they discovered something that made the Vatican's worst nightmare look like a pleasant dream. Jesus didn't just know about the betrayal, he orchestrated it. The text is crystal clear about this. Jesus pulls Judas aside, away from the other disciples, and delivers these exact words: "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Let that sink in for a moment. This isn't Satan whispering in Judas's ear. This isn't greed driving him to collect 30 pieces of silver. This is Jesus Christ himself giving direct orders to his most trusted disciple. But it gets even more mind-bending. According to this gospel, Jesus reveals cosmic secrets to Judas that he keeps hidden from Peter, James, John, and all the rest. While the other disciples are stumbling around, arguing about who's the greatest, Jesus is having private conversations with Judas about the true nature of reality. He calls Judas his most trusted friend and explains something that would make every Sunday school teacher in America quit on the spot. The crucifixion, Jesus explains, isn't about dying for humanity's sins. It's about escaping. In the Gnostic worldview presented in this text, the physical world is essentially a prison. We're trapped in material bodies, controlled by a false god who wants to keep us separated from the true divine source. Jesus came here not to die for our sins, but to show us the way out. And the only way he could return to the divine realm was to shed his physical body. Think about the theological earthquake this creates. If Judas was following direct orders from Jesus, then he's not the ultimate traitor, he's the ultimate loyalist. He's the one disciple willing to bear eternal shame and hatred to fulfill the cosmic plan. While Peter would deny Jesus 3 times to save his own skin, Judas agreed to become the most hated man in history because Jesus asked him to. This completely inverts the traditional Christian narrative. Instead of Judas being possessed by Satan, he's the only disciple spiritually advanced enough to understand what Jesus was really trying to accomplish. The text portrays their relationship as teacher and star pupil, not master and betrayer. Jesus trusts Judas with knowledge he doesn't share with anyone else, because Judas alone can handle the truth about the nature of reality. Now you understand why Bishop Irenaeus was so desperate to destroy this text. The Orthodox Christian Church was building its entire power structure on guilt, redemption, and the need for priestly mediation. They needed people to believe they were sinful, that Christ died because of their wickedness, and that salvation could only come through the institutional church. The Gospel of Judas obliterates that entire framework. If Jesus came to liberate us from material bondage rather than die for our sins, what do we need priests for? If the goal is to escape the physical world and return to divine consciousness, why do we need elaborate church hierarchies? If Judas was the hero instead of the villain, how much of the official story is completely backwards? The Gnostic Christians who treasured this text had a radically different understanding of Jesus' mission. They saw him as a cosmic liberator, not a sacrificial lamb. They believed salvation came through knowledge, gnosis, not through institutional sacraments. They thought the material world was created by a lesser deity, sometimes called the demiurge, who wanted to keep humanity trapped and ignorant of their divine nature. This wasn't just the Gospel of Judas making these claims. Other Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi tell the same story from different angles. The Gospel of Thomas presents Jesus sharing secret teachings with his disciples about the divine spark within each person. The secret book of John describes how the false god created the material world as a prison to trap divine souls. The Gospel of Philip talks about the bridal chamber, a mystical union that allows souls to transcend physical reality. What emerges from these texts is a completely different version of early Christianity. Instead of one unified church teaching consistent doctrine, you had dozens of competing Christian sects, each with their own scriptures, their own interpretation of Jesus' message, and their own practices. The Gnostics were just one branch, but they were incredibly influential in the first few centuries after Jesus' death. The version of Christianity that eventually won out, what we now call Orthodox Christianity, didn't triumph because it was theologically superior. It won because it got political backing from the Roman Empire. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, he needed a unified church that could help him control his vast empire. The Gnostic emphasis on individual spiritual experience and direct connection to the divine didn't serve imperial purposes, but a hierarchical church that taught obedience to authority. That was politically useful. So the church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries didn't just decide doctrine based on spiritual truth. They made political calculations about what would serve imperial power. The Gospel of Judas, with its message that the most trusted disciple was the one who helped Jesus escape the material world, had to be eliminated. It suggested that the real enemy wasn't human sinfulness, but the false authorities who wanted to keep people trapped in ignorance. The implications ripple through everything we think we know about Christianity's origins. What if the disciples who seem most faithful in the canonical Gospels were actually the ones who misunderstood Jesus' mission? What if the institutional church that claims apostolic succession is built on the foundation laid by the disciples who got it wrong? What if the real Christian message was preserved by the groups that Orthodox Christianity spent centuries trying to destroy? The Gospel of Judas forces us to confront these questions because it presents such a radically different picture of Christianity's most pivotal moment. Instead of a divine sacrifice for human sin, we get a cosmic escape plan. Instead of the ultimate betrayal, we get the ultimate act of loyalty. Instead of Satan's victory, we get the liberation of divine consciousness from material bondage. No wonder they tried so hard to erase it. Picture this: Jesus sits with his 12 disciples, listening as they eagerly share their mystical visions and prophetic dreams. But instead of blessing them or affirming their spiritual insights, he does something that would make any modern Christian deeply uncomfortable. He laughs at them. Not a gentle chuckle of affection, but the kind of laughter that cuts. The Gospel of Judas records Jesus responding to his disciples' visions by saying, "Why have you become so angry? Your God who is within you has provoked anger within your souls. Let any of you who is strong enough among human beings bring out the perfect human and stand before my face." The disciples can't do it. They fall silent, unable to meet this challenge. All except Judas, who steps forward and declares, "I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbelo." This scene reveals something that mainstream Christianity has spent 17 centuries trying to bury. According to this gospel, Jesus viewed his closest followers not as future church leaders, but as spiritually blind guides who would lead millions astray. The text doesn't mince words about Peter, James, and John. These men, revered as pillars of the early church, are portrayed as fundamentally missing the point of Jesus' teachings. When they describe their visions of temple sacrifice and priestly rituals, Jesus responds with what can only be described as divine exasperation. He tells them directly that they worship the wrong God entirely. Here's where it gets disturbing for anyone raised in traditional Christianity. Jesus warns Judas that the other disciples will establish a religion based on sacrifice and blood offerings, leading people to worship what the Gnostics called the demiurge, a false creator god who built the material world as a spiritual prison. The text quotes Jesus saying to Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Think about what this means. If authentic, this gospel suggests that Jesus himself predicted his own followers would corrupt his message so completely that they'd create the opposite of what he intended. Every doctrine of apostolic succession, every claim that the Church Fathers preserved the true teachings, every foundation stone of institutional Christianity suddenly becomes questionable. The Gospel of Judas operates from a radically different understanding of human nature and salvation. Most people, according to this text, are essentially sleepwalking through existence, trapped in what Gnostics called material illusions. They mistake the physical world for ultimate reality and worship its creator, never realizing they're in a cosmic prison. But some individuals possess what the text calls the divine spark, a fragment of the true, transcendent God trapped within their material bodies. These people have the potential for gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge that allows them to see through the demiurge's deception and escape the cycle of physical existence. Jesus tells Judas something that would be considered heretical in any mainstream church. "But you will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Already, your horn has been raised, your wrath has been kindled, your star has shone brightly, and your heart has become strong." Judas belongs to what Jesus calls the holy generation, an elite group capable of transcending physical reality entirely. This isn't salvation through faith in Jesus' sacrifice for sin. This is liberation through understanding the true nature of reality and one's own divine essence. Scholar Elaine Pagels, who spent decades studying Gnostic texts, explains that this completely inverts traditional Christian theology. Instead of Jesus dying for humanity's sins, he's helping select individuals realize they don't need salvation from sin at all. They need awakening from illusion. Bart Ehrman, one of the world's leading New Testament scholars, points out that if the Gospel of Judas represents authentic early Christian thought, then what we call Orthodox Christianity might actually be the deviation from Jesus' original teachings. The implications are staggering. Consider how this reframes everything. The disciples' inability to understand Jesus isn't portrayed as temporary confusion that will be resolved after his resurrection. It's presented as fundamental spiritual blindness that will lead them to create a religion Jesus never intended. The text describes Jesus explaining to Judas that the other disciples will lead people to worship through sacrifice and ritual, never understanding that these practices actually strengthen the demiurge's hold over human souls. They'll teach people to seek salvation through external means instead of discovering the divine light within themselves. This is why early church fathers like Irenaeus were so threatened by Gnostic teachings that they ordered their complete destruction. These weren't just alternative interpretations of Christianity, they were direct challenges to the entire institutional framework the church was building. If Jesus actually taught that most people, including his own disciples, were spiritually asleep, and that only a few possessed the capacity for true awakening, then Christianity as we know it becomes something entirely different. It's not a universal religion offering salvation to all who believe. It's an esoteric teaching meant for those rare individuals capable of transcending material existence entirely. The Gospel of Judas suggests that while the 11 disciples went on to establish churches and convert thousands, they were actually spreading a false gospel that would trap souls more deeply in material illusion. Meanwhile, Judas, the supposed traitor, was the only one who truly understood Jesus' message and helped him accomplish his real mission. This raises questions that go far beyond academic theology. If this text is authentic, then every Sunday service, every prayer for salvation, every doctrine taught in seminaries might be built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what Jesus actually came to teach. We're looking at the possibility that Christianity's most revered figures were, according to Jesus himself, the very people who would ensure his true message never reached the masses. The betrayer becomes the faithful disciple, and the faithful disciples become unwitting agents of spiritual deception. Here's what the Gospel of Judas reveals that makes Orthodox Christianity so uncomfortable they had to bury it. The God that most Christians pray to every Sunday isn't the true divine source at all. According to this text, he's actually a cosmic fraud, a false deity who trapped humanity in this material prison we call reality. The Gospel presents a radically different cosmology than anything you've heard in church. Picture this: beyond our physical universe exists the true, unknowable God, so transcendent that human language can't even describe it. This supreme being exists in perfect unity with itself, generating what the text calls aeons, divine emanations of pure consciousness and light. These aren't gods exactly, but aspects of the infinite divine mind expressing itself. But here's where things get wild. One of these emanations, through ignorance and arrogance, breaks away from the divine unity and creates our material world. The Gospel of Judas calls this rogue creator Saklas, which literally means fool in Aramaic. This isn't the loving father figure Christianity teaches about. This is the demiurge, a deluded cosmic architect who genuinely believes he's the supreme God, because he can't see beyond his own creation. Think about the implications here. When Jesus explains this to Judas in the text, he's essentially saying that the other disciples, and by extension, most of humanity, are worshipping the wrong deity entirely. The Gospel records Jesus telling Judas, "The God whom your disciples serve is not the true God. These disciples pray to the creator of flesh and matter, not the source of divine light that Jesus actually represents." This completely reframes Jesus' mission. He didn't come to reconcile humanity with the Old Testament God. He came to expose that deity as an impostor and show the path back to the true divine realm. When you read the canonical Gospels with this lens, suddenly Jesus' mysterious statements start making sense. Why does he call Satan the prince of this world? Why does he insist his kingdom is not of this world? Because this entire material reality is under the dominion of the false god. The Gnostic interpretation turns the entire biblical narrative inside out. Remember Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Orthodox Christianity teaches their disobedience brought sin into the world. But according to Gnostic understanding, their expulsion from Eden was actually liberation from the demiurge's control. The serpent wasn't evil, it was a messenger of truth, trying to awaken humanity to knowledge that the Creator God wanted to keep hidden. This explains something that's bothered biblical scholars for centuries. Why does the God of the Old Testament seem so different from the loving Father Jesus describes? The wrathful deity demanding blood sacrifices and commanding genocide isn't the same being as the source of unconditional love. They're literally different entities, the vengeful demiurge versus the true divine source. For Gnostic Christians, this material world isn't God's good creation that got corrupted by human sin. It's inherently flawed because it was built by a flawed creator. Your physical body isn't a temple, it's a prison cell for your divine soul. The goal isn't to perfect this world or resurrect these bodies, but to escape this entire cosmic mistake and return to the realm of pure spirit. Now consider what this means for modern religious practice. If the God that most people worship in churches, synagogues, and mosques is actually the demiurge, then billions of prayers are being misdirected. All that spiritual energy, all that devotion, flowing toward the very entity that's keeping humanity trapped in ignorance. It's like prisoners thanking their warden for the privilege of staying locked up. The Gospel of Judas suggests that only through gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge, can you recognize the true divine source beyond this material illusion. This isn't intellectual understanding you get from reading books or listening to sermons. It's a fundamental shift in consciousness that reveals the nature of reality itself. This concept isn't unique to Gnostic Christianity. Plato's allegory of the cave describes humanity as prisoners mistaking shadows on a wall for reality itself. Hindu philosophy teaches about Maya, the cosmic illusion that makes the temporary appear permanent and the false seem real. Buddhist teaching points to the illusory nature of the material world and the need to see through these appearances to achieve enlightenment. What makes the Gospel of Judas so dangerous to Orthodox Christianity is how it explains the contradictions that thoughtful believers have always struggled with. Why do bad things happen to good people if God is all-loving and all-powerful? Because the entity running this world isn't all-loving. He's the demiurge, concerned primarily with maintaining his cosmic control system. The text reveals that Jesus chose Judas, precisely because Judas could handle this radical truth. While the other disciples remained attached to traditional religious concepts, Judas was spiritually mature enough to understand that sometimes you find have to betray the false to serve the true. His act of betrayal becomes the ultimate act of faith, trusting Jesus' vision over conventional religious wisdom. This teaching cuts to the heart of humanity's spiritual confusion. We sense there's something more than this material existence, but we keep looking for it in the wrong places. We pray to the architect of our prison instead of seeking the key to our cell. The Gospel of Judas suggests that true spiritual liberation requires recognizing this fundamental mistake and redirecting our spiritual seeking toward the authentic divine source beyond all created things. You know what's fascinating about the early Christian world? For the first 3 centuries after Jesus died, there wasn't one Christianity. There were dozens of competing sects, each with their own gospels, their own interpretations, their own practices. And here's what will blow your mind. In many regions across the Roman Empire, Gnostic Christianity wasn't some fringe movement. It was actually more popular than what we now call Orthodox Christianity. Think about that for a second. The Christianity that survived, the one that became the official religion of the Western world, wasn't chosen because it was more truthful or more authentic. It survived because it served the political needs of an empire. Let me paint you a picture of what Christianity looked like in, say, 250 CE. In Alexandria, you'd find Christians reading the Gospel of Thomas, believing that the kingdom of heaven was found within individual spiritual awakening. In Syria, communities followed the Gospel of Philip, practicing sacred marriage rituals and rejecting the material world as a prison. In Gaul, what we now call France, Gnostic teachers like Valentinus had established schools that attracted thousands of followers who believed the God of the Old Testament was actually a false deity keeping humanity trapped in ignorance. These weren't small, underground movements. Archaeological evidence shows us Gnostic communities with elaborate churches, extensive libraries, and sophisticated theological schools. In some regions, they outnumbered Orthodox Christians 3 to 1. So what happened? How did this rich, diverse, spiritual landscape get reduced to a single, authorized version? The answer lies in one of history's most consequential political calculations. Enter Constantine in 312 CE. Here's a guy who's fighting for control of the Roman Empire, and he has a vision, or claims to have one, of a Christian cross in the sky. Whether that vision was real or just brilliant political theater, Constantine recognized something crucial. Christianity, in some form, was going to dominate the empire. The question was which form would serve his purposes best. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, he wasn't just picking a religion, he was picking a tool of governance. And when he convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the decisions made there had nothing to do with divine revelation and everything to do with imperial administration. Here's what Constantine and his advisors understood that most people miss. Orthodox Christianity was perfectly designed for empire. It emphasized hierarchy, obedience to earthly authority, and the idea that salvation came through institutional channels. Remember Jesus' words about rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. That wasn't just a throwaway line. It became the foundation of a church-state partnership that would dominate Western civilization for the next 1,700 years. Compare that to Gnostic Christianity, and you can see why it terrified imperial authorities. Gnostics taught that all material authority was illegitimate because the material world itself was a trap created by a false god. They believed every individual had direct access to divine truth through inner awakening. They didn't need priests, bishops, or emperors to mediate their relationship with the divine. Imagine trying to run an empire when your subjects believe that all earthly authority is spiritually illegitimate and that true salvation comes from rejecting the material world you're trying to get them to participate in. It's a political nightmare. So Constantine and his successors made a calculated choice. They backed the version of Christianity that told people to obey earthly rulers, pay their taxes, and find salvation through institutional channels that the empire could control and regulate. The canonical Gospels weren't chosen because they were more historically accurate. They were chosen because they supported imperial goals. And here's where it gets really dark. The church-state partnership that emerged didn't just promote Orthodox Christianity, it systematically destroyed the alternatives. We're not talking about gentle theological debates here. We're talking about armed raids on Gnostic libraries, the burning of thousands of texts, and the execution of anyone found possessing banned Gospels. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius issued his famous Easter letter listing the 27 books that would become the New Testament canon. But the real power of that letter wasn't what it included, it was what it banned. Possession of non-canonical Gospels became a capital offense. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Apocryphon of John. Owning any of these texts could get you killed. The persecution was so thorough that by 400 CE, Gnostic Christianity had been virtually wiped out. The only reason we know about the Gospel of Judas today is because some brave soul buried it in a jar in the Egyptian desert, hoping future generations might rediscover these suppressed truths. What's chilling is how this process mirrors modern information control. Think about how institutions today decide which narratives become official truth, while marginalizing or ridiculing alternatives. The mechanisms have evolved, but the underlying pattern remains the same. Those in power determine which stories get told and which get buried. This isn't ancient history, it's a blueprint that's been used repeatedly throughout human civilization. Empires have always used religion to maintain social order. Look at how modern prosperity gospel keeps people focused on individual salvation rather than questioning systemic inequality. Look at how inconvenient spiritual or historical truths get dismissed as conspiracy theories or fringe beliefs by institutional authorities. The Roman Empire understood something that modern power structures still exploit. If you can control people's spiritual narratives, you can control their political behavior. Orthodox Christianity gave Rome exactly what it needed, a religion that sanctified imperial authority while promising otherworldly rewards for earthly obedience. But here's what they couldn't completely erase: the hunger for direct spiritual experience that Gnostic Christianity represented. That impulse toward individual awakening, toward questioning material authority, toward seeking truth beyond institutional control, it keeps surfacing throughout history, no matter how hard established powers try to suppress it. The Gospel of Judas survived because that hunger for authentic spiritual truth is indestructible. It's been buried, banned, and ridiculed, but it always finds a way to resurface, challenging us to question not just what we believe, but who decided what we should believe and why. You think you're just a human being stumbling through life trying to figure out what it all means. But according to the Gospel of Judas, that's exactly what they want you to believe. Because the moment you realize what you actually are, their entire system of control crumbles. The text reveals something extraordinary about human nature that makes every religious authority nervous. Jesus tells Judas that within every person burns a divine spark, what the Gnostics called pneuma, not metaphorically, symbolically, literally. You carry within you a fragment of the true divine realm, trapped inside this material prison we call reality. Think about that for a moment. If this is true, then you're not some fallen creature begging for salvation from external sources. You're not dependent on priests or churches or religious institutions to connect you with the divine. You are divine essence, temporarily experiencing itself through human consciousness. The Gospel of Judas explains that most people live their entire lives without ever awakening to this reality. Jesus describes them as spiritually asleep, completely identified with their physical existence, never suspecting the cosmic identity hidden within them. They worship external gods, follow religious rules, and seek meaning outside themselves while carrying the very thing they're searching for. But here's where it gets fascinating. The text describes three distinct types of human beings based on their relationship to this inner divine spark. The pneumatic people, the spiritual ones, have active divine sparks that are awakening or already awakened. These individuals naturally question authority, seek direct spiritual experience, and resist being controlled by external religious systems. Then you have the psychic people, those with souls that can be awakened. They're caught between the material and spiritual worlds. They sense something deeper but haven't yet activated their divine potential. Most people fall into this category. They feel that nagging sense that something's missing, that life has to mean more than what they've been told. Finally, there are the helic people, completely material beings who are entirely identified with physical existence. They can't conceive of anything beyond the material world. They're the ones who dismiss spiritual concepts entirely and ridicule anyone who suggests reality might be more complex than what meets the eye. Now, if you understand this framework, the entire purpose of spiritual practice transforms completely. Instead of worshipping external deities or following religious commandments, the goal becomes awakening your inner divine spark and remembering your true cosmic identity. Instead of seeking salvation from outside sources, you're recovering your own inherent divinity. This is why Jesus' role in the Gospel of Judas is so different from Orthodox Christianity. He's not dying as a sacrifice for humanity's sins. He's teaching people how to activate their own divine potential. When Jesus tells Judas he will reveal to him mysteries no human has ever seen, he's not talking about religious doctrines or moral teachings. He's explaining how to recognize and awaken the divine consciousness that's been dormant within human beings. The practical implications of this understanding are staggering. If you contain divine essence, then external religious authority becomes not just unnecessary but potentially harmful. Any institution that positions itself as an intermediary between you and the divine is actually blocking your direct access to your own spiritual nature. The text describes the awakening process as recognizing the illusory nature of material existence and remembering your origin in the true divine realm. It's about seeing through the cosmic deception that keeps divine sparks trapped in material bodies, believing they're separate from their source. This teaching empowers radical individual spiritual autonomy. You don't need permission from religious authorities to connect with the divine. You don't need to confess your sins to priests or follow institutional guidelines for salvation. You need to wake up to what you already are. And this is precisely why early church authorities worked so hard to suppress these texts. Imagine what happens to religious institutions when people realize they carry divinity within themselves. Imagine what happens to priestly authority when people discover they can access divine consciousness directly. This isn't just ancient Gnostic philosophy. Similar concepts appear across mystical traditions worldwide. Hindu teachings about Atman, the divine self within every being. The Hermetic principle, as above, so below, suggesting the divine pattern exists at every level of reality. Sufi mysticism describing the beloved within the heart. Buddhist concepts of Buddha nature, inherent in all consciousness. Even modern quantum physics and consciousness research hint at these ancient insights. Studies of near-death experiences consistently report encounters with divine light that people recognize as their true nature. Quantum mechanics suggests consciousness might be fundamental to reality rather than emerging from brain activity. Research into meditation shows that contemplative practices can trigger profound shifts in identity and perception. When you understand your divine nature, your relationship with fear, death, and material attachments fundamentally changes. Death becomes a transition rather than an ending. Material possessions lose their grip because you recognize your essential nature transcends physical form. Fear diminishes because you realize your core identity is indestructible. The Gospel of Judas suggests that Jesus understood this completely. His teachings weren't about moral behavior or religious observance. They were about awakening people to their cosmic identity and helping them remember who they really are beneath the layers of material conditioning. This is why studying these suppressed texts matters so much. They're not just historical curiosities. They're roadmaps to understanding human potential that religious institutions spent centuries trying to hide. The question becomes, what happens when enough people wake up to their divine nature? What happens when spiritual authority shifts from external institutions back to individual consciousness where it belongs? The Gospel of Judas suggests that's exactly what those in power have been desperate to prevent. The entire foundation of Catholic authority rests on one crucial claim, that Jesus Christ himself designated Peter as the first pope, establishing an unbroken chain of divine authority that flows through every subsequent bishop and priest. They call it apostolic succession, and it's the bedrock justification for why you need their institution to reach God. But here's what they desperately don't want you to discover. The Gospel of Judas completely demolishes this narrative. According to Catholic doctrine, Jesus told Peter, "You are the rock upon which I will build my church," granting him special keys to heaven and earth. Every pope since then claims this same divine authorization, insisting that salvation flows exclusively through their sacraments, administered by their ordained priests. It's a neat system. They control access to God, and you pay, pray, and obey accordingly. But when you read what Jesus actually tells Judas about the other disciples, a radically different picture emerges. Jesus explicitly warns Judas that the 12 apostles will establish a corrupted religious system that leads people away from genuine spiritual truth. In one of the most stunning passages, Jesus tells Judas, "The 12 disciples you have seen offering sacrifice at the altar, that is who you have seen. Those are the ones who will use my name to lead the multitudes astray." Think about the implications here. Jesus himself is predicting that his closest followers will create religious institutions that actually serve the demiurge, the false god of material control. rather than facilitating genuine spiritual liberation. When Jesus describes the disciples offering sacrifices at the altar, he's describing exactly what became the Catholic Mass, with its elaborate rituals and claims of transforming bread and wine through priestly authority. The Gospel of Judas reveals that Jesus saw through the power-hungry tendencies of his disciples. He tells Judas that they will lift up their voices to God and perform religious ceremonies, but they'll be worshipping the wrong deity entirely. The disciples will establish a hierarchical system where spiritual access gets filtered through human intermediaries, precisely the opposite of direct divine connection that Jesus actually taught. This completely undermines 2,000 years of Christian institutional claims. If Jesus himself predicted that Peter and the others would corrupt his message and create false religious structures, then every pope, bishop, and priest claiming authority through apostolic succession is building on a foundation that Jesus explicitly rejected. What makes this even more devastating for church authority is how it aligns with things Jesus said in the canonical Gospels that somehow get glossed over in Sunday sermons. Remember when Jesus told his disciples, "You are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father in heaven." Or when he warned them not to seek titles like teacher or master. These weren't casual suggestions. They were direct rejections of the hierarchical religious authority that the Catholic Church later built its entire structure around. Gnostic Christianity operated on completely different principles. Instead of institutional hierarchies, spiritual knowledge passed directly from teacher to student through personal revelation and inner experience. There were no elaborate cathedrals, no papal infallibility, no requirement for priestly mediation between humans and the divine. The Gnostics understood that each person contained that divine spark we discussed earlier, making external religious authority not just unnecessary but potentially harmful to genuine spiritual development. This is exactly why early church fathers like Irenaeus worked so frantically to establish apostolic succession as official doctrine. They weren't preserving some ancient tradition. They were creating a new power structure specifically designed to counter Gnostic claims about direct spiritual access. Irenaeus and his contemporaries realized that if people believed they could connect with the divine directly, through their own inner experience and personal revelation, then elaborate church hierarchies became obsolete. The power struggle that shaped early Christianity wasn't really about theological fine points. It was about control. Orthodox leaders needed to establish exclusive interpretive authority over Jesus' message, while simultaneously declaring any alternative understanding heretical. They succeeded so completely that for over 15 centuries, possessing texts like the Gospel of Judas could get you tortured and killed. But here's what this means for anyone seeking genuine spiritual truth today. If priestly mediation is not only unnecessary but potentially counterproductive to real spiritual growth, then your direct experience becomes paramount. You don't need someone in special robes performing magical rituals to connect you with the divine. That connection already exists within you. Throughout history, institutional Christianity has consistently suppressed mystical experiences and direct revelation in favor of controlled doctrine and standardized ritual. Medieval mystics like Meister Eckhart got investigated for heresy when they described direct divine encounters that bypassed church authority. The Inquisition specifically targeted anyone claiming personal spiritual revelation that contradicted official teaching. Even today, Catholic doctrine maintains that private revelation must be validated by church hierarchy to be considered legitimate. This pattern extends far beyond religious institutions. Any organization that maintains power by claiming exclusive access to truth while suppressing individual autonomy operates on the same principle. Political parties insist you need their expertise to understand complex issues. Medical establishments claim only licensed professionals can understand health and healing. Educational institutions assert that knowledge only counts if it comes through their credentialing systems. The Gospel of Judas supports what Protestant reformers intuited about individual relationship with the divine, but it goes much further. While Protestants rejected papal authority, they still maintained clerical hierarchies and institutional biblical interpretation. The Gnostic perspective questions whether any external religious authority is ultimately legitimate when it comes to your personal spiritual development. This doesn't mean spiritual teachers and guides have no value, quite the opposite. But their role becomes facilitating your own direct connection rather than serving as mandatory intermediaries. They point you toward your own inner divine spark rather than insisting you need their institution for salvation. The question becomes, are you ready to explore what genuine spiritual autonomy might look like? Or will you continue accepting that someone else's interpretation of ancient texts should determine your relationship with the divine? Because once you understand how completely the Gospel of Judas undermines institutional religious authority, going back to spiritual dependency becomes much more difficult. The Gospel of Judas represents just the tip of an enormous iceberg. What you've learned about this single suppressed text is part of a systematic pattern of archaeological and historical cover-up that's been going on for over 70 years. The evidence sitting in academic vaults and private collections would fundamentally reshape everything you think you know about early Christianity. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi struck his shovel against a large earthenware jar. Inside, wrapped in leather bindings, were 52 complete texts that had been hidden in the desert for over 16 centuries. These weren't copies of known gospels or church documents. These were entirely different Christian writings that painted a radically alternative picture of Jesus' teachings and the early Christian movement. The Nag Hammadi library contained gospels, secret teachings, and mystical texts that showed early Christianity as an incredibly diverse, decentralized spiritual movement focused on direct personal gnosis rather than institutional authority. Yet it took over 30 years for complete translations to become publicly available. 30 years of academic committees, translation delays, and restricted access, while these revolutionary documents sat largely hidden from the world. Among these suppressed texts was the Gospel of Thomas, containing 114 secret sayings attributed directly to Jesus. Unlike the canonical Gospels with their emphasis on Jesus' death and resurrection, Thomas focuses entirely on Jesus as a teacher of hidden wisdom. The kingdom of heaven is within you and outside you, Jesus tells his disciples. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. This isn't the Jesus of institutional Christianity. This is a teacher pointing people toward their own divine nature, explicitly telling them that salvation comes through self-knowledge rather than faith in church doctrine. Even more threatening to Orthodox Christianity was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which depicts Mary not as a reformed prostitute, but as Jesus' most advanced disciple and the recipient of private teachings that even Peter and the other male apostles didn't receive. When Peter objects to Mary's authority, Jesus defends her spiritual understanding as superior to the other disciples. The text presents Mary as the true successor to Jesus' mystical teachings, completely undermining the male apostolic succession that became the foundation of church hierarchy. The secret book of John goes even further, presenting a complete cosmological system that portrays the God of the Old Testament as a false created deity, while the true divine source remains hidden beyond material creation. According to this text, Jesus came not to die for humanity's sins, but to awaken people to their divine origins and help them escape the prison of material existence controlled by archonic forces. These aren't fringe documents written by later heretics. Carbon dating and textual analysis confirm these Gospels emerged from the same time period and geographical regions as the canonical Gospels that made it into the New Testament. They represent authentic early Christian communities with radically different understandings of Jesus' message. But here's what's truly disturbing about how these discoveries have been handled. The Gospel of Judas itself disappeared into private collections for decades after its discovery in the 1970 seconds. While the papyrus deteriorated in a safety deposit box, scholars who knew of its existence were denied access. When it finally surfaced for translation, the initial team was sworn to secrecy, and the full text wasn't released until 2006, over 30 years after its discovery. This pattern of suppression extends far beyond early Christian texts. Archaeological discoveries that challenge established religious or historical narratives routinely get buried in academic bureaucracy, dismissed without proper investigation, or simply ignored by mainstream institutions. Scholars who pursue research into these alternative histories often find their funding cut, their academic positions threatened, and their work marginalized as fringe scholarship. Dr. Elaine Pagels at Princeton, one of the few mainstream scholars willing to seriously engage with Gnostic Christianity, has described the institutional resistance she's faced throughout her career. When her groundbreaking book, The Gnostic Gospels, brought these suppressed texts to public attention, she was criticized by colleagues for giving credibility to heretical materials that should remain academic curiosities rather than subjects of serious theological consideration. The reason for this ongoing suppression becomes clear when you understand what's at stake. Modern Christianity is built on the claim that Jesus established a single, unified church with clear doctrinal authority passed down through apostolic succession. The existence of dozens of equally authentic early Christian texts, showing a diverse, mystical, anti-institutional movement, completely undermines this foundation. Churches have invested 2,000 years in developing complex theological systems, institutional hierarchies, and claims to exclusive spiritual authority. Acknowledging that early Christianity was actually a decentralized movement of individuals seeking direct spiritual knowledge would essentially admit that modern church institutions represent a fundamental departure from Jesus' original teachings. The financial implications alone are staggering. The Catholic Church controls assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, justified by its claim to be the one true church established by Christ. Protestant denominations have built massive institutional empires based on their own interpretations of biblical authority. Admitting that the canonical Bible represents only a small fraction of authentic early Christian literature would raise uncomfortable questions about the legitimacy of these entire systems. This is why you'll find these suppressed Gospels relegated to academic specialty courses or dismissed as interesting historical artifacts with no relevance to contemporary spirituality. The texts are acknowledged to exist, but their implications are carefully contained within scholarly discussions that never reach mainstream religious education. Even more troubling is how discoveries that challenge religious narratives get labeled as conspiracy theories or New Age nonsense, effectively discrediting them before serious investigation can occur. The term Gnostic itself has been weaponized to suggest something foreign and heretical, when these texts actually represent some of the earliest documented Christian communities. But you don't have to remain dependent on institutional gatekeepers to access this suppressed spiritual knowledge. Complete translations of the Nag Hammadi library are now available in multiple editions. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Secret Book of John, and dozens of other texts can be read and studied by anyone willing to engage with primary sources rather than accepting second-hand interpretations. Start with the Gospel of Thomas and compare its teachings directly to the canonical Gospels. Notice how different the emphasis becomes when Jesus is presented primarily as a wisdom teacher rather than a sacrificial victim. Read the Gospel of Mary and consider how Christianity might have developed differently if feminine spiritual authority had been preserved rather than systematically erased. The suppression continues, but the evidence is now available for anyone ready to look beyond the carefully constructed narratives that serve institutional power rather than genuine spiritual understanding. The question isn't whether this alternative evidence exists, it's whether you're willing to examine it for yourself, rather than accepting what you've been told to believe about early Christianity's true diversity and mystical foundations. Looking at everything we've uncovered about the Gospel of Judas and the systematic suppression of early Christian texts, you're probably feeling a mix of fascination and disorientation right now. That's completely normal. When you realize that everything you were taught about Christianity, divine authority, and spiritual truth has been filtered through institutions with very specific agendas, it can shake your entire worldview. But here's what I want you to understand. This disorientation isn't a problem to solve. It's the first step toward genuine spiritual freedom. The Gospel of Judas isn't just an ancient curiosity gathering dust in some academic journal. It's a roadmap for breaking free from 2,000 years of spiritual programming. Think about what this text actually reveals. Jesus didn't establish a hierarchical church with special priests holding divine authority. He didn't condemn his closest disciples to hell for their humanity. And, most importantly, he taught that the divine spark exists within each person, not locked away in some distant heaven, accessible only through institutional gatekeepers. This changes everything about how you approach spirituality. When you understand the true relationship between Jesus and Judas, teacher and advanced student, not master and betrayer, you see that the goal was never blind obedience to religious authority. It was individual awakening to your own divine nature. Jesus wasn't trying to create followers. He was trying to create other awakened beings who could think and experience the divine directly. Now, let me give you some practical steps for deprogramming from religious conditioning, because knowing this intellectually isn't enough. You need to actively break free from the psychological chains that keep most people trapped in limiting belief systems. First, start questioning every piece of religious authority you encounter. When someone claims to speak for God, ask them where they got that authority. When a religious leader tells you that you need their mediation to reach the divine, remember what the Gospel of Judas teaches. You already contain that divine spark. No external validation required. Second, seek out primary sources rather than interpretations. Read the Nag Hammadi text yourself. Study the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip. Don't let anyone else tell you what these texts mean. Engage with them directly and form your own understanding. The early Christian movement was incredibly diverse and sophisticated before it was sanitized by imperial politics. Third, develop direct spiritual practices. The Gnostic texts emphasize meditation, contemplation, and inner knowing over ritual and doctrine. Start spending time in quiet reflection. Pay attention to your own inner wisdom rather than constantly seeking external authorities to tell you what to think or believe. But here's where it gets psychologically challenging. Even when presented with clear evidence that their religious programming is limiting them, most people resist change. Why? Because guilt, fear, and social pressure are incredibly powerful forces. You might worry about disappointing family members who are deeply religious. You might fear that questioning your faith means losing your community or your sense of meaning. These are real concerns, and I'm not going to tell you they're easy to navigate. What I will tell you is this: authentic spirituality requires courage. The people who preserved texts like the Gospel of Judas faced persecution and death to keep these teachings alive. The least we can do is have the courage to read them with open minds. For those of you ready to explore authentic spirituality beyond institutional control, here's your practical framework. Connect with others who are asking similar questions, but maintain your intellectual independence. Don't trade one form of groupthink for another. Study comparative religion and philosophy to understand how many different cultures have approached divine experience. Learn about meditation practices from various traditions: Buddhist mindfulness, Sufi contemplation, Christian mysticism that predates institutional control. Most importantly, recognize that your own direct experience is valid. You don't need a priest to interpret your spiritual insights. You don't need institutional approval to connect with ultimate reality. The Gospel of Judas supports what mystics from every tradition have discovered. The goal isn't worshipping external deities or following religious rules. It's awakening to your true divine nature and helping others do the same. This connects to something much larger happening in our world right now. More people than ever are questioning institutional authority across every domain: political, medical, educational, and religious. We're in the middle of a massive awakening where individuals are reclaiming their right to think independently and seek truth directly. But with this knowledge comes responsibility. Those of us who understand how these suppressed truths have been hidden have an obligation to share them with others who are ready to receive them. Not everyone is ready. Some people find comfort in institutional religion, and that's their choice. But for those asking deeper questions, we need to provide access to the information that's been kept from them. True spiritual liberation isn't just an individual journey. It requires collective transformation. We need to break free from the systems that keep humanity spiritually enslaved while simultaneously helping others discover their own divine potential. This means supporting research into suppressed texts, funding archaeological work that uncovers early Christian diversity, and creating communities where people can explore authentic spirituality without institutional pressure. The Gospel of Judas survived nearly 2,000 years of suppression because truth has a way of persisting. These teachings were preserved by people who understood that future generations would need access to unfiltered spiritual wisdom. Now it's our turn to carry that torch forward. Your spiritual journey doesn't require anyone else's permission. The divine spark that Jesus recognized in Judas exists in you too. The question isn't whether you're worthy of direct spiritual experience. You already are. The question is whether you have the courage to claim it. If this exploration of suppressed spiritual wisdom resonated with you and opened new possibilities for your own spiritual journey, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."